Hello, good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf. I'm the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center, and on behalf of Professor Gates and all of us here, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this virtual space for Lee D. Baker's lecture today. We're really excited to hear what he has to say. One brief housekeeping item, please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you keep them brief as there are many of you and we anticipate that there will be many questions. Questions may also be edited for clarity and length during the Q&A. First, it's my pleasure to say a few words about Kaya Naomi Williams, who will introduce Professor Baker's lecture this afternoon. Dr. Williams is currently a postdoctoral college fellow in the Department of Anthropology here at Harvard. As of July 2021, she will be assistant professor of anthropology at Harvard. Congratulations, Dr. Williams. She earned her BA at Harvard.
Here. Amen. Back on mute.
She earned her BA at Harvard and her PhD at the University of Chicago, both in anthropology. Dr. Williams does ethnographic work on violence and captivity in the United States. Her current work focuses on efforts to change local practices of incarceration in New Orleans, Louisiana, tracing projects shared across networks of policymakers, litigants, and organizers. Her research focuses ethnographically not on the practice of confinement itself, but on the daily work of the individuals and communities whose labor seeks to fundamentally change American responses to crime. In so doing, her work raises questions about the cultural, economic, and effective investments that produce incarceration in the US as a supposedly intractable problem. We so appreciate her joining us today and hope that it will be the first of many visits she makes to the Hutchins Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaya Naomi Williams this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Abby. And thank you to Professor Gates for inviting me to introduce Professor Baker. I'm really looking forward, it's an honor to be here. I do hope to be back, and I'm really looking forward to the talk. So Professor Lee D. Baker is the Mrs. A. Hemeyer Professor of Cultural Anthropology, Sociology, and African-American Studies at Duke University. He received his bachelor's degree from Portland State University and his doctorate in anthropology from Temple University. His work focuses on the entangled histories of anthropology and race. His books include From Savage to Negro, Anthropology and the Construction of Race, 1896 to 1954, which was published in 1998. Life in America, Identity and Everyday Experience, published in 2003, and Anthropology and the Racial Politics of Culture, published in 2010. Professor Baker has been a resident fellow at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Johns Hopkins Institute for Global Studies, the University of Ghana, Legon, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Humanities Center. His awards include the Richard K. Lublin Distinguished Teaching Award and the American Anthropological Association's Award for Distinguished Achievement in the Critical Study of North America. From 2008 to 2016, he also served as Duke's Dean of Academic Affairs. On a personal note, From Savage to Negro was on the syllabus of the first anthropology class I ever took when I was an undergraduate, still planning to major in physics. Wow. I think probably if I had not, I think had it not been, I probably would not be here today. I was and I remain totally captivated by the idea of a discipline whose methodological and theoretical tools can be productively turned on the conditions of scholarship themselves. And Professor Baker is an exemplar in doing just that. His talk today is titled The Racist Anti-Racism of American Anthropology, and I'm delighted to welcome him to this virtual space. Professor Baker.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been, it's an honor, and really I'm excited to give this lecture. Before I really begin, I have to give some thank yous out, particularly to my wife, Sabrina, and N.A.A.C.P. Baker, who helped get this lecture together and gave me some good feedback, as well as Matt Weinberg and his team for all the logistics, as well as all the setting everything up. But mostly, I really have to thank Skip, Henry Louis Gates, for not just inviting me for this distinguished lecture, but literally for supporting me from the very beginning of my career. When I was a graduate student at Temple University, just writing up my dissertation, I applied and was selected by him or his committee to be a Du Bois Institute Fellow. And that really enabled me to do research and really launch my career. But then in 2013, when he got his honorary degree from Duke, and I was serving as dean, I had a number of years to go, and he probably assumed, like was often the case, that there would be more administrative roles coming. And he stopped me and says, we need you back in the classroom. We need you to do more scholarship and, really consider not going the administrative track, because there's real joy in being a professor and the graduate students need you. And I thought about that, and it really did shape my choice to go back to do new research projects and, focus on my graduate students. So really thank him. And for citing me so explicitly in Stony the Road. What a wonderful book that is. I was just like, wait, what? And so that also was legitimate. So these types of support for faculty is really, really important. So thank you, Skip. And I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope I can do this well. Work hard and play by the rules. This simple phrase is an integral part of the mythology of the American dream. But so many working class and people of color know that one can work very hard and play by the rules, but still lose the game. The implication is that if you work hard and assimilate American culture, you can make it in the United States. Racism, however, consistently snatches the American dream from the clutches of many hardworking Americans. Exactly 100 years ago, anthropologist Franz Boas observed that racism and discrimination encumbered and threatened the success of Negro achievement. He also saw his Jewish friends and family assimilate and become white and American. This observation led him to believe that, quote, the Negro problem will not disappear in America until the Negro blood has been so much diluted that will no longer be recognized. Just as anti-Semitism will not disappear until the last vestige of the Jew as a Jew has disappeared. Assimilation or Americanization was a powerful concept because it assumed equal potential and mobility. It did not, however, address racism or discrimination. As sociologist Robert E. Park quipped in 1914, if they were given an opportunity, the Japanese are quite as capable as the Italians, the Armenians, or the Slavs of acquiring our culture and sharing our national ideals. The trouble is not with the Japanese mind, but with the Japanese skin. The Jap isn't the right color. In this presentation, I'm going to tell stories of assimilation as racism. Even though the characters are striving to be anti-racist, they engaged and articulated racism and helped to consolidate whiteness. These are also historical case studies of what Eduardo Bonia Silva so eloquently explains as racism without racists. I will start with the Orphan Train and Indian boarding school movements to demonstrate how integral assimilation was to the idea of an American at the turn of the century. I will then turn to Franz Boas's massive study of immigrant amalgamation and conclude with his call for Negro amalgamation. Let's get started. Share my On November 18th, 1904, 12-year-old Bella Quince and 9-year-old Madeline Heller joined a dozen other children, ranging in ages from 19 months to 13 years, on the stage of Van Warden's Opera House in the tiny southern hamlet of Leon. Hailing from surrounding counties, family farmers crowded into the Opera House that afternoon. Bella and Madeline and the other children arrived in Leon by train and were a long way from home. Madeline came from the Brooklyn Industrial School and home for destitute children. Bella grew up with her older brother and younger sister in the 5 Point House of Industry in Lower Manhattan. It was a week before Thanksgiving, and the good people of Leon were looking to expand their families with orphans from New York who could also serve as cheap farm labor. The local paper reported, quote, the children were the brightest and best dressed lot of waifs that have ever been brought to this county, and there was no trouble finding people who were willing to take the little ones in as members of their families. Not unlike a drove of cows or a sounder of prize sows, the children lined up and prospective parents carefully poked and prodded inspected and scrutinized each child before making their selection of whom would join them for Thanksgiving. The previous week, the Children's Aid Society of New York took out an advertisement in the Leon Reporter that announced Homes Wanted for Children. A company of orphan children will arrive at Leon. Sandwiched between ads for yeast and the Great Acorn gas burner, the announcement explained that distribution will take place at the Opera House at 1:30. There was, of course, fine print. The object of the coming of these children is to find homes in your midst, especially among farmers, where they may enjoy a happy and wholesome family life where kind care, good example, and moral training will fit them for a life of self-support and usefulness. The society retains the right to remove a child at any time for just cause and agrees to remove any found unsatisfactory after being notified. The Children's Aid Society, or CAS, carefully selected Bella and Madeline to be placed out. Charles Loring Brace, the founder of CAS, began placing out orphaned, abandoned, and surrendered children to new families in 1854. He was an idealistic theologian who responded to the estimated 30,000 homeless children who experienced punishing poverty, wretched housing, infectious disease, and paralyzing immobility in mid-century New York. Brace outlined the organization's goals and mission in its first circular, which began with a lament that something must be done to meet the increasing crime and poverty among the destitute children of New York. Steeped in Protestant righteousness and optimistic rhetoric that all children have the same capacity, he aimed to aid, quote, this great multitude of unhappy, deserted, and degraded boys and girls. The organization was probably sincerely motivated by saving the children, but it was equally concerned with children growing up as poor Democrats in New York. Seeking political and financial support, Brace and the CAS peddled imminent doom. These waifs will soon form the great lower class of our city. They will influence elections. They may shape the policy of the city. They will, assuredly, if unreclaimed, poison society all around them. They will help to form the great multitudes of robbers, thieves, and vagrants who are now such a burden upon the law-respecting community. The society did challenge the philosophy of many reform organizations because they did not believe that idleness, improvidence, and drunkenness were hereditary in character. Fresh air, hard work, the gospel of Christ in a family could transform these poor wretches into real Americans, which meant white Protestants. That is why the CAS was so committed to, quote, draining the city of these children, and of course, future voters. Between 1854 and 1929, the Children's Aid Society and other organizations that followed were responsible for putting an estimated 250,000 children on trains from Northeast urban city streets to Midwestern rural farms. One donor to the CAS believed that, quote, the law of child supply and child demand can be adjusted like that of commercial commodities. As the number of orphan trains began picking up steam, the CAS developed a tightly choreographed ritual. They selected children who were not sickly, developmentally disabled, incorrigible, nor Black. They then gained legal custody of the children. Not all inmates of orphanages were orphans. Poor parents sometimes had to abandon or surrender their children. The agency deployed Western agents to identify prospective towns and convene local leaders to screen applications. Tightly knit towns rarely rejected one of their own. Agents and chaperones would give the children a haircut and a new set of clothes. The children would board the so-called orphan trains in a precarious state of liminality, leavened by a collective sense of excitement and hope. When the thunderous trains came to small towns like Leon, shopkeepers and barkeeps, leaders and laborers would watch with curiosity and amusement as the company of orphans disembarked. At each stop, agents lined up the children for inspection at a church or an opera house. The pre-approved parents would have an opportunity to examine each child and make their selection and take one or two home. Children not selected would be put back on the train, taken to the next town down the line, and the ritual of distribution, as the CAS called it, would begin again. Many children found loving and supportive families. Many others, however, were victims of physical abuse, sexual violence, and labor exploitation. The orphan train movement is one of many complicated examples of how assimilationist ideas produce racism and white supremacy. Simultaneously, it contributed to indigenous land disposition, Native American displacement, and the destruction of tribal nation sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Homestead Act of 1862, the Dawes Act of 1887, and other legislation conspired and collided with the massacre at Bear River, Sand Creek, and Marias River, and finally Wounded Knee in 1890 to make the second half of the 19th century a formative period in the long history of dispossession and attempted genocide of indigenous nations. Homesteaders played a critical role in the process of displacing and dispossessing indigenous nations on the plains. Homesteaders needed cheap labor, and New Yorkers needed to get rid of homeless children. As Poles, Italians, and Slavs replaced the Irish as the new and most impoverished immigrants, the locomotives kept running these not quite white orphans west. The children riding the orphan trains playing an almost perfectly aligned roles in empire building, indigenous genocide, and the consolidation of whiteness. After a 4-day train ride, Leon, Iowa transformed Bella and Madeline from hungry peddlers and pickpockets to corn-fed white girls helping their new family establish a homestead on the plains. Promoters of this overnight civilization of waifs copied their much more sophisticated doppelganger, the Carlisle Indian School, by staging dramatic before and after portraits. In 1879, Richard Henry Pratt took command of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in South Central Pennsylvania. Known for his famous slogan, "Kill the Indian and save the man," Pratt's philosophy was to erase and replace indigenous culture with Christian civilization through strict discipline that combined military organization, penal incarceration, and industrial education. The day his first party of students arrived, he requisitioned 4,000 feet of picket fence 6 feet high to keep the Indians in and the citizens out. Some children came by choice, others came by force, most came by train. The first group of 82 children, mostly Oglala Lakota, arrived by train on October 6, 1879. In one of those eerie mirror plot lines that happen so routinely in the construction of race and white supremacy preservation, the trains ran in opposite directions. Carlisle agents took children from families in the Midwest and put them on trains to institutionalize them in the East. In contrast, CAS agents took institutionalized children in the East and put them on trains to place them with families in the Midwest. Deploying the very same logic regarding assimilation, agents institutionalized Indian children while emancipating white ones. Between 1879 and 1918, Carlisle enrolled over 10,000 students from over 140 nations and became the template for the 26 Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools and hundreds of missionary boarding schools. These institutions became critical operations in the campaign to assimilate and eradicate American Indian bodies, culture, and identity. The orphan train and Indian boarding school movements were just two of many, many policies and programs committed to assimilation that went, well, off the rails. Assimilation was a compelling discourse and movement that challenged and served as a foil to segregation, eugenics, xenophobia, and anti-immigration. But here's the thing about foils or heroes or villains. They are characters in the same story, and this is the story of white supremacy. Eastern European immigrants who followed the seductive prescription of a strict regime of assimilation became white and American, while Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans became respectable. Both nativists and assimilationists viewed Chinese and Japanese immigrants as unassimilable. Settlement house workers, missionaries, and the YMCA viewed Americanization rhetoric and assimilationist policy as a progressive way to unite all Americans. People viewed its cognate cousin, amalgamation, as even radical. Yet assimilation was a racist idea that contributed to white supremacy because it equated Americanness with whiteness. And it was a coercive social control mechanism that disciplined and surveilled European immigrants while using a Sharpie to demarcate the color line. In 1904, immigration to the United States exceeded 800,000. Theodore Roosevelt told a joint session of the 58th Congress that, quote, "We cannot have too much immigration of the right kind, and we should have none of it at all of the wrong kind. The need is to devise some system by which undesirable immigrants shall be kept out entirely, while desirable immigrants are properly distributed throughout the country." Congress agreed and set out to develop a fair and scientific system. Vermont Senator William Dillingham was the chair of the Senate Committee on Immigration and brought Roosevelt two bills to sign, the Naturalization Act of 1906 and the Immigration Act of 1907. Together, this legislation outlined new processes and federal standards for naturalization and immigration, and it made speaking English a requirement for citizenship. It also clarified that, quote, "all idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded people, epileptics, insane persons, and people who have been insane within the last 5 years were to be denied entry." It also denied access to people, quote, "likely to become a public charge, criminals, anarchists, polygamists, prostitutes, and contract laborers." Chinese exclusion remained intact. Finally, it authorized a bipartisan joint commission to study different aspects of the immigration question scientifically. The hope was that science could inform legislation to mitigate, manage, and restrict the throngs of tempest-tossed masses arriving on America's shores. President Roosevelt appointed a 9-member joint commission that included the moderate Dillingham and the conservative Henry Cabot Lodge. The president also appointed Jeremiah Jenks, a political economy professor at Cornell University. The 9-member commission convened in April of 1907 and elected William Dillingham, chairman of the commission. Known as the Dillingham Commission, it was Professor Jeremiah Jenks who drove the capacious research agenda that deployed over 300 staff members to investigate nearly every aspect of the immigrant problem. Jenks assembled an impressive team of distinguished scholars and commissioned them to write book-length monographs. In March of 1908, Jenks approached the prominent anthropologist Franz Boas about investigating, quote, "the question relating to the immigration of different races into this country." Franz Boas was an assimilated German Jew who came to the United States to pursue a science career and his fiancée in 1887. He conducted linguistic research in the Pacific Northwest, ethnographic research in Greenland, and physical anthropological studies of so-called half-blood Indians and immigrant children. Columbia University had recently appointed him as professor of anthropology. During this period, influencers reinforced the strict racial hierarchy with science that purported that Teutonic and Aryan whites were naturally and morally superior to others who were less fit and socially inferior. The perceived superiority of Christian civilization was all the evidence they needed to confirm it. As early as 1894, Boas argued that, quote, "historical events appear to have been much more potent in leading races to civilization than their faculty. Therefore, we cannot, quote, assume that one race is more highly gifted than the other. It is hardly possible to say," he wondered, "what would become of the Negro if he were able to live with the whites on absolutely equal terms. Instead of viewing the Negro as inferior, we might rather wonder how much has been accomplished in a short period against heavy odds." Boas was one of the most accomplished anthropologists in the country. He was consistent and effective in the battle against scientific arguments that positioned races or cultures in a hierarchy. He was also an immigrant and incredibly skeptical of reformers who used the science of pure and superior races to support regulating and restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. After the initial inquiry by Jinks, Boas wasted no time and fired off an ambitious 7-page proposal to examine the children of immigrants' head shape and bodily form. He began by describing the change in immigration from, quote, this is Boas, tall, blonde, Northwestern type to the masses of people belonging to the East, Central, and South European types that are now pouring into our country. Boas confidently proposed a simple but profound research question to frame his elaborate proposal. How will this change in physical type of immigrants influence the marvelous power of amalgamation our nation has exhibited for so long a time? In total, he proposed measuring a whopping 120,000 immigrants. Boas' enthusiasm for the massive project and his posture as an assimilated and white American is evident in the proposal's last line. I can assure you that the practical results of this investigation will be important because it will settle once and for all the question whether the immigrants from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe are and can be assimilated by our people. Jinks told Boas that he consulted 2 Cornell anthropologists who expressed a strong favorable opinion regarding the quality of the proposal, although both of them are of the mind that possibly the concluding sentence is somewhat too enthusiastic. By the middle of May, the commission finally authorized the study, but only allocated $1,000 and expected a narrower scope and a preliminary report before committing to fund it in its entirety. Boas wasted no time, and he assembled his team, which consisted mostly of graduate students, Columbia colleagues, and a handful of paid assistants. His main assistants were C. Ward Crampton and Dr. Maurice Fishberg. Crampton was vital because he was the director of physical training for the New York Board of Education and got Boas into the public schools. In a mad dash to measure as many school children as possible before the summer recess, they scattered across the city, armed with an official letter of introduction from the United States Immigration Commission that implied that it was once patriotic, quote, rendering a genuine service to the public. One team went north to the brand new Gothic campus on 130th Street to measure students at City College and its affiliated high school. Crampton set off with 500 slips and went to work measuring students in the public high schools throughout the city. Boas took a crew down to Ellis Island. As the health officials checked for trachoma, lameness, and insanity, Boas weighed and measured the new arrivals with tape and calipers. They eventually made their way to the schools and orphanages of the Children's Aid Society. If Bella and Madeline had not boarded the orphan train to Iowa 4 years earlier, Boas would have measured them too. Boas and his team measured nearly 13,000 people that summer. It was a frenetic season of weighing and measuring, tabulating and correlating, organizing and categorizing. In the middle of it all, Boas sent Jinks an optimistic note. I think these results will throw a great deal of light upon the processes that are at work in Americanizing or keeping distinct, inform the American population of descendants of recent immigrants. Boas submitted an update to Jinks at the beginning of September. Although characteristically cautious, Boas reported, much to my surprise, an important change in type may also be noticed in East European Jews. The race is very short-headed, but there is a decided tendency to an increase in the length of head among the latter immigrants. The commission agreed to continue funding the project, but only in a paltry and peaceful fashion. The research continued apace into the school year, focusing on Russian and Jewish and Southern Italian immigrants. As autumn wore on, Boas became bitter because he was not getting paid what he expected. As winter turned to spring, he kept measuring children and families throughout the boroughs. Money problems continued to bedevil the project. I am very much embarrassed on the account of the payments to my assistants. My assistants have not received any pay so far. Boas was exhausted and exacerbated. This is exceedingly embarrassing to me, he lamented and pleaded with Jinks to straighten up the entire matter. Although frustrated by funding shortfalls, Boas was buoyed by his data, particularly among the Eastern European Jews and Southern Italians. He was confident that the data would enable us to draw unassailable conclusions in regard to the influence of the American environment on these two types. Boas spent the summer organizing and analyzing over 26,000 immigrants' measurements compiled into 504 pages of raw anthropometric data. An astonishing pattern emerged from the detailed statistics. In October, Boas confidently reported to Jinks that, quote, as far as the head form is concerned, the exceedingly short-headed Eastern European and the exceedingly long-headed South Italian converge to the same form, even in the first generation of descendants of immigrants. I believe this fact is highly significant. Jinks wanted the full report by March, but Boas begged for more time. Quote, the statistics are so involved, the results so radically opposed to all of our present theories that it seems indispensable to exclude in the most careful manner every possible source of error, which might serve as a basis of an attack on the validity of our results. Boas understood that his data would challenge the scientific consensus that racial features like the cephalic index characterized a stable and permanent type that lasted without variation. His data indicated that immigrants' children became much more like the American norm in one generation. On December 2nd, 1909, Boas sent Jinks his preliminary report. He was confident that the report would, quote, bring about a radical change in our whole conception of racial stability. My computer's getting glitchy.
You're frozen, Lee, if you can hear me. Matt, do you want to send, oh, Lee, you're back?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm having some computer problems, of course.
Oh, that's okay. Everybody freezes at least once during a Zoom. Don't worry. You're on a roll. This is fascinating, man.
Thank you. Okay, am I back? It's hard to tell if I'm freezing or not.
No, you're back. You're back.
Okay, thank you. The commission present. The commission present.
Go ahead.
Okay, the commission presented Boas's report to Congress on December 16th, 1909. The next day and weeks after, newspapers and magazines wrote articles and summaries and editorials across the country and the pond. The United Press wired a dispatch to all of its syndicates, so even the smallest papers reported the story. The Fargo, Forum, and Daily Republic headlined "An American Type" and noted the chief surprising result thus far attained is that of rapid assimilation to a distinctly American type. Wilmington's Evening Journal headline, "America Changes Immigrants' Form." The Washington Times suggested that, quote, if all comers to American soil merge in the direction of a common American type, the logic of the situation is that we have no cause to fear immigration. The Baltimore Sun, Chicago Daily Tribune, the Santa Fe New Mexican, the Washington Post, the Washington Evening Star, and even the Napa Weekly Journal ran articles detailing the preliminary report's findings and hailing the American type. Britain's Manchester Guardian wrote, "The report should bring some comfort to those patriotic Americans who believe that foreign immigrants to the United States are a menace to their race." Hampton's magazine, with a circulation of almost 500,000, thoroughly misquoted Boas, stating that Boas asserted that, quote, asserted that children of immigrants become Americanized by the very air of America, forming a type distinct from their parents, and that the new type was American, not foreign. Burton J. Hendrick of McClure's magazine wrote one of the report's most sophisticated and detailed reviews in the popular press. The 15-page essay directly challenged the more sensational interpretations and showed detailed pictures, maps, and graphs. We must understand, he wrote, that the term American type is, from the standpoint of science, pure nonsense. But if it is possible in a single generation to give the child a different shaped skull from his parents, it is likewise possible to fill it with high ideals, to make him what his father was not and probably never can be, an intelligent, self-respecting, industrious American. Boas' report went viral, well, for its day, as Israel Zangwill's influential play, The Melting Pot, concluded its 4-month run on Broadway. And in the wake of George Cohan's super patriotic musicals like Little Johnny featuring Yankee Doodle Dandy in 1904 and The American Idea in 1908, each depicting recent immigrants becoming true blue, or more accurately, true white Americans. The New York Times ran several less sensational and more skeptical articles about the report. The New York Times, however, published 2 full broadsheet spreads and gushed praise. One summarized his research and concluded, quote, the fears of the Native American that he may be swamped by the influx of Magyars, Slovaks, and other impossible peoples are utterly groundless. The other New York Times magazine was a lengthy interview with Boas about his findings. It ran the day after Christmas. It had pictures, graphs, and research tables, and headlined, Professor Boas gives startling results. Startling is a large word to use, the Times admitted, but it is only what is called for by the results of Professor Boas's work. The final sentence concluded with an optimistic quote from Boas. So far as the races of Europe are concerned, there is nothing in evidence that would stamp one as inherently less able than the other. The reporter didn't follow up. Was Boas implying that races other than Europeans were stamped from the beginning? 4 days later, on New Year's Eve, 1909, Boas provided some critical insight into this question. Taking advantage of his recent publicity, he asked for more funding to expand the study. Boas explained to Jenks that if his research could be extended, quote, all fear of unfavorable influence of Southern European immigration upon the body of our people should be dismissed. Quote, perhaps more important, Boas explained, is the problem of mixtures of distinct types. Here is particularly the question of the mixtures between the Negro and the white that should receive particular attention. Broadly speaking, the question before us is that of whether it is better for us to keep an industrially and socially inferior large Black population, or whether we should fare better by encouraging a gradual process of lightening up this large body of people by the influx of white blood. Expressing the same question still in other words, we might say the question before us is whether conditions can be so regulated that without proportionate increase in the Black population, it will be of advantage to accelerate the infusion of white blood among them. Regulating reproduction through segregation and sterilization were the cornerstones of the eugenics movement. Boas was floating the wacky idea that the federal government should somehow develop a eugenics program to incentivize or regulate the process of lightening up of Black people by the infusion of white blood. He didn't speculate about the details. The marvelous power of amalgamation, which he touted in his original proposal, transformed Eastern and Southern Europeans effortlessly into an American type. The power of amalgamation was not so marvelous for the industrially and socially inferior Negro. They would need some assistance to become American. Franz Boas was an indefatigable crusader against scientists and policy makers who used their authority to argue that races and cultures were superior or inferior. He attacked their logic and flimsy evidence with rigor and enthusiasm. However, there was limits to his liberalism. In the winter months of 1909-1910, Boas presented compelling evidence to Congress that Sicilians and Russian Jews, two distinct inferior races of Europe, became American in one generation, which was anti-racist sort of for them. With the eager press riding shotgun, he won a significant shootout in the battle to consolidate whiteness, which buoyed the nascent Americanization movement with scientific evidence. The trade-off and long-term consequences for non-white people were devastating. Boas had to emphasize the broad gulf of difference between the white races or types and non-white races. The slip sliding between race and type, and American, Boas also contributed to, and the press enthusiastically influenced, the alignment of whiteness with what it means to be American, which was an articulation of anti-Black racism. Boas first proposed the idea of Negro amalgamation in December 1908 when he gave his vice presidential address to Section H of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Baltimore. In the bulk of his paper, he argued that there are no pure races or stocks in Europe. And while there are subtle regional differences, most Europeans were admixtures of these types. He concluded his talk with a discussion about Negro admixtures. When compared with the contrast between the Negro and white, Boas explained, the differences of the European type seem insignificant, and the unity of the European race, as contrasted with that of the Negro race, becomes at once apparent, end of quote. Looking into the distant future, he concluded, the number of full bloods will rapidly decrease, and since there is no introduction of new Negro blood, there cannot be the slightest doubt that the ultimate effect of the contact between the two races must necessarily be the continued increase in the amount of white blood in the Negro community. Boas published his address in the May issue of Science, and W.E.B. Du Bois reprinted most of it in the November issue of The Horizon. Du Bois and Boas had collaborated previously, and Du Bois would often cite Boas's claim that Africans were smelting iron when Europeans were still using stone tools. Du Bois must have been intrigued with the address because he invited Boas to expand on it for the final lecture at the upcoming N.A.A.C.P conference that May. Boas' paper at the organization's second annual conference was entitled The Real Race Problem. He began his lecture using his signature formula and preferred tactic to combat the science of racial superiority, which was serving as scientific skeptic and debunker in chief. He asserted that, quote, anthropologists recognize that the Negro and the white represent the two most divergent types of mankind. Boas explained the whole anatomical and physiological comparison of the Negro and the white race may be summed up by the fact that hardly any traits develop in a manner that we are justified in calling one race anatomically or physiologically higher than the other. So far, Boas had given what had evolved as something of a formulaic stump speech. Unlike previous lectures, Boas shifted gears from describing and debunking to prescribing and provoking. Boas shared the observation that in countries around the world inhabited by Northern Europeans, particularly Teutonic nations, the intensity of race feeling is calibrated by the magnitude of the social divisions. Boas was not optimistic that, quote, our general attitude will change to any appreciable degree with a measurable time. So he prescribed for the Negro the somewhat successful strategy of German Jews, not necessarily Russian Jews, of actively assimilating within American society. In 1921, Boas described the strategy more succinctly. In a race of octoroons living among whites, the color question would probably disappear. As Boas saw it, the new Negro was no Negro at all. For the N.A.A.C.P, Boas advanced a provocative strategy. It was nothing short of conceding that if you can't beat them, join them. Boas stated, quote, it seems obvious that our race problems will become less intense the less difference in type there is between the different groups of our people, concluding that One aspect of the Negro problem lies entirely in the hands of the Negro himself. Perhaps he should have said herself. Boas sincerely, if not naively, believed that African-American women should take proactive steps to quicken the inevitable process of lightening up the race through amalgamation. The previous year, he presented a rather clinical description of the AAAS. For the N.A.A.C.P, however, he gave a full-throated exegesis on the gender dynamics of interracial sex and the racial politics of classifying children born from those sexual encounters, voluntary or not. The simple facts, it's a quote, that the Negroes and Europeans live side by side in our country, that the European receives constant large additions from abroad, while the amount of Negro blood receives no additions from the outside, must necessarily lead to the result that the relative number of pure Negroes will become less and less in our country. The gradual process of elimination of the full-blooded Negro may be retarded by anti-miscegenation legislation, but it cannot possibly be avoided. Boas was aware of what he called the bulky literature of the subject of miscegenation, most of which he believed did not stand up to serious criticism. He also understood the phantasmic panic, fear, and the ensuing violent terror meted out on the bodies of Black men who allegedly polluted the purity of white womanhood. However, Boas implied there was no need to fear because there was, quote, a very serious misunderstanding of the actual conditions of intermixtures of Negro and white. And this is a long quote, but I think it really frames Boas's sort of position and perspective. So the fear is often expressed that by intermixture between whites and Negroes, the whole mass, and he's giving this to the N.A.A.C.P, right? The whole mass of white people might be infused with a certain amount of Negro blood. This is not what has actually occurred, but would result if unions between white women and Negro men were as frequent as unions between Negro women and white men. As a matter of fact, however, the former type, that of the Negro male and that of the white female, are exceedingly few in number as compared to the others. It therefore follows that our mulattoes are almost throughout the offspring of Negro mothers and white fathers. It thus appears that in all cases where a mixture between whites and Negroes occurs, as long as that mixture is predominantly a mixture of white fathers and colored mothers, the relative proportion of blood in the following mixed generation becomes less, and therefore a gradual increasing similarity of the two racial types may develop. Boas stated that this one aspect of the solution of the Negro problem lies entirely in the hands of the Negro himself. Wittingly or not, Boas was prescribing a program of applied eugenics as a solution to the race problem. And white people need not fear amalgamation because it only improves the Negro race and does not impair the white race. Boas never mentions the 300 years of industrial terrorism in the form of routinized rape of Black women by white men. Yet, not so subtly, he implied that the solution to the real race problem lies between the legs of Black women. Whew. The New York Times headline, Professor Boas predicts race amalgamation means Negro elimination. The union of white fathers and mothers will bring this about. The Baltimore Afro-American reported extensively on the 3-day conference and excerpted many of the conference speakers. The editors declined to mention Boas except as one of many speakers. Du Bois selected Boas's The Real Race Problem as the lead article for the second issue of the first volume of The Crisis. In 1912, Boas subsequently issued it as one of the NAACP's many standalone pamphlets. It is not entirely clear to me why Du Bois promoted this address so conspicuously. Did the ever-pragmatic Du Bois make a calculated decision that the body of the address, which the nation's foremost anthropologist explicitly argued that the Negroes were not inferior to whites mentally and physiologically, and that outweighed the cringeworthy solution? Or did Du Bois want to promote any legitimate science that endeavored to hush the relentless din of panic scholars reinforcing Jim Crow by claiming that African Americans were inherently inferior and warning that miscegenation would befall American civilization? What is clear to me is that progressive ideals grounded on assimilation can go off the rails, like the Orphan Train and American boarding school movements. The early Americanization movement had to demonstrate the enormous gulf between white races to show that between white and other races to show that Southern and Eastern Europeans would become just as American as other whites. C. Loring Brace, Richard Henry Pratt, and Franz Boas sincerely believed in the power of assimilation and that the right government the right environment can improve life outcomes. Bella and Madeline were proof of that. Like many progressive era reformers, each was striving to find solution to combat race antipathy, or today we would say do the work of anti-racism. But racism is a scavenger ideology. It maintains its power by being able to appropriate, pick out, recycle, and deploy ideas from other ideas and values, or use different ideas toward the same end of consolidating and institutionalizing white supremacy. Many of the 20th century solutions to its many problems, Negro, immigrant, Indian, Asian, turned on the lose-lose and inherently racist debate around segregation with its autonomy and agency, or assimilation with its dependency and conformity. And this is my sort of conclusion. So for out of the way others like Native Americans and people in American colonies such as Samoa, anthropologists articulated a powerful and persuasive anti-racist discourse of cultural autonomy and agency and racist segregation. For in the way others like immigrants and Black people, anthropologists joined sociology and social work to articulate a powerful and persuasive anti-racist discourse of equality and potentiality and racist assimilation. And that tension is something that I was trying to get at, and that is the conclusion of my talk, and I'm looking forward to questions. Let me stop sharing.
Great. I'm back on video and unmuted. Lee, thank you so much for this talk.
Yeah, it was fabulous.
It was incredible.
Riveting. Kaya, you want to ask the first question and respond? That was amazing.
I do, yeah. My first question was just, oh my goodness, what should we do? But I'm going to ask another follow-up question as well. I'm torn between two, so perhaps I'll just ask them both. One is, I was sort of struck by the first story that you told of the orphans and the way in which, for sort of the ones who are sickly, developmentally disabled, incorrigible, or Black, they're not even eligible for this, but then for the ones who sort of can be whitened, it's still so many of them end up suffering terrible abuse. And I was wondering, and I feel like then you sort of move into this story in which the European immigrants who are sort of being whitened as well are also being heavily surveilled, measured, subjected to similar, different, but also sort of types of abuse. So I guess my first question is just, what would you say, how does the sort of question of abuse fit into this, into what you're sort of mapping out? Is there sort of a role, you're sort of talking about white supremacy in particular, and I'm wondering what it has to do with abuse? You're muted.
To say I think the trauma or the abuse is that there's a cost even for white people to articulate and extend and participate in white supremacy. And even for these children that didn't really have a choice in the matter. I mean, they wanted to get out of the orphanage. They were excited when they boarded the train. But some of the women, were sexually abused, and going through the newspaper accounts, I didn't share it because it didn't quite fit, but there'd be descriptions of the 14-year-old girl going first, like being selected. So these kids would get lined up, and then like if you didn't get selected in that town, you'd have to go to the other. You'd be crushed. Like was it chopped liver? And so there was the psychological dimensions. I mean, people do this research. I was just using it as many examples. But I guess to answer your question is, yeah, along the line, even to assimilate, there were costs involved and trauma and drama and abuse to participate in this process. And I think the orphan trains become one examples. But then the upside is different than the boarding school, which was the exact same philosophy or ideology of, assimilation is good and the right environment will help these individual children. So even these children didn't have much of a choice in it.
I will ask one more question, sure.
Of course, yeah.
I guess the other, I'm struck by just how often Boas is on the front page of the newspaper. And I'm wondering, sort of thinking about anthropology today, whether you have any thoughts about sort of how, because I think a lot of the things that you're describing, the sort of, good intentions going awry, continue to express themselves in so many different ways today. But very few of us are being quoted in the New York Times. And I'm wondering what you think sort of that means for how we should be thinking about this.
Yeah, I think, so two things, that's right. And anthropology sort of lost, after World War II, the story, probably Margaret Mead was one of the largest big public intellectuals. And once it no longer sort of identified as a science and the science of culture, it just kind of lost its authority. And I've written about that. But I would say that the New York Times is so late 19th century. We have a big impact on Twitter, these podcasts, particularly the Black anthropologists today. I mean, they are on fire. The up and coming scholars, and they really are shaping not only the political discourse, around anthropology, but taking that authority of sort of culture and race, having authority and helping to educate a whole generation. And the number of anthropologists involved in Black Lives, the movement for Black Lives. I mean, I think we're helping to get the job done in sort of not the sort of hegemonic ways, but more sort of grassroots ways. I don't do social media that much, and I'm just like very impressed.
When I was an undergraduate, I went to Yale in 1969. Anthropology was one of the hottest majors.
Yeah.
Forget econ. Nobody even took economics seriously. Sid Mintz's class,
right?
Like a cast of thousands. And that changes. I often tell my students, disciplines have fads too. Discourses have fads. But I didn't know about this tension between Ashkenazi Jews and Eastern European Jews until I was in graduate school, and someone directed me to The World of the Fathers, or by Irving Howe and his son, I think, who changed the name back to the original. I believe that was the combination, and it was about the history of Jewish immigration and Ashkenazi German Jews and Eastern European Jews and Class A plus Sephardic Jews, and so when I hear your marvelous lecture and see those illustrations and think how relevant it would be for debates about immigration today, for this message to be broadly circulated, I want you to publish op-ed page articles just about the snootiness of, toward Italians, that they smell bad and have these did they have the long heads and the Russian Jews had the round heads?
Yeah.
But just breathing American air changed your head. Like, what kind of shit is that? Who actually thought that was true? That's crazy. And is there any, just tell me who could actually believe those headlines,
the thing is, but Skip, the data was there. I don't think some people have said he kind of fudged the data and stuff, but basically it was nutrition, it was an environment, and a whole lot of sort of things. But the idea was that these were set racial types in Europe. But once they come to America and their mother has birth here, they become American. But people thought it was more than just, and we're talking millimeters here. I mean, but I do believe, and people have looked at his data, they do change. So, but then how people generalize, once you say, a head change, and that makes them more American, then it's the very air they breathe. So there was some data that was driven those headlines, or
But
at least
it's,
the data that Boas collected.
but it strikes me as Boas wanted to make some quote unquote scientific argument in order to encourage immigration. And he's sitting around, he's a genius, and he goes, you know, if I just do a millimeter here, these idiots are going to believe that this is all a good idea. And they're going to use all this to justify the larger political program that I want them to engage in. I mean, do you think he was being cynical and manipulative in a positive way? I mean,
oh yeah. And later on, he gets involved with more of the immigration debate, and he's very much, anti-immigration restriction. So you can see what he was doing too. He carefully looked at Sicilians, not like other Italians, very specific Sicilians and Eastern European Jews, East Russian Jews. And there was other immigrants there, but they didn't have the same, quick, convergence to the American type. So he self-selected. I mean, he was very selective of which data he presented in this report that went to Congress. And then he extrapolated. And if you read him carefully, he doesn't go more beyond the Sicilians and the Russians, but he then extrapolates, it's all immigrants. All immigrants are doing this. So he's moved. Yeah, you're exactly right. He was like, if I just shave a millimeter off here.
Because he didn't have any of these prejudices, right?
No, I mean, he had prejudice, but they were pro. Like he was against immigration restriction. He was against Jim Crow laws. He was for Negro equality. I mean, he would just had limits to his ability, and I think he sincerely believed that amalgamation was a good solution.
Right.
But Skip, that was a radical. I mean, it's we kind of laugh at it now, and it looks a lot like the Indian boarding school. But at the time, that would have been, I don't know, seen as very subversive.
Oh yeah, and even today, people say, "Well, one day we're all going to be brown." I mean, just look at the mixed race commercials. I haven't read a good analysis of them or a good count, but hybridity is happening on TV commercials. There are so many interracial couples. I can't believe it. I'm wondering if they're being shown in Alabama, Mississippi, and in Trump land. Have you noticed what I mean? And
yeah.
The American capitalism has decided it could sell products better through amalgamation images, quote unquote. And it's like I've been Rip Van Winkle. Woke up one day and I saw these interracial couples on TV. Wondered, what did I miss? What discourse? But let's open it up. Abby, you're curating. The fabulous, riveting.
Oh, thank you so much.
You have to do an op-ed page piece showing these prejudices against white immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe by other white people. I mean, that makes the point of anti-immigrant feeling so brilliantly.
Oh, and rooted in the history that people were really fearful of the Slovaks and Czechs.
Yeah, and to show that anti-immigrant feeling, it just was, it was like the old Mr. and Miss Potato Head, I mean, it had one type and you just change you change the name under it. But anyway, thank God I got that honorary degree and we met at that reception, and you're writing and not just being one more administrator, because you're smoking, man. I love your work. I
really thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for your kind words. I'll shut up now because Abby will kick me under the Zoom table and tell me I'm hogging up the time. But I'm going to be here.
My own round, broad head is spinning right now from this conversation. That was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. But you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from the audience. So there's a question here that maybe you could say a little bit more. This kind of, as this question came in right before Skip started talking about the interracial couples on ads, but it seems relevant here. Valerie Ashby says, given all that you have said about the whitening of Black people, what do you think today about the browning of America in 2021? How are white people defining America now as they grow to be the minority? How is it that people are still ignoring science and genetics today in the discussion of race?
Well, Valerie, Valerie is my dean. Thank you for and my boss for checking that out.
Good first question.
No, I think it's hard to have a crystal ball, but we can see white supremacy holding on very tenaciously. And it's going to look like South Africa. It's going to look like Jamaica. Skip probably has some better insights on this to me. I don't think there's going to be some seeding of whiteness in the category of whiteness for the majority of brownness, even though these racial categories are going to get much more blurred as we know it from the 19th century. It's going to maybe look more like Central and South America or something, but I'm not holding my breath that the majority of brown people will somehow gain power in the United States, which is a settler colonial, country that's sort of rooted in white supremacy and always giving a little bit every generation to make it seem like we're having a more perfect union. But it's not enough, I don't think. So Valerie, I wish I could give you a more optimistic assessment, but I'd love to hear. So I got Skip here. I'd love to hear his riff on this because I'm sure it's a question he gets often.
Oh, look. I don't know if Skip knows that you just addressed him. So, okay. Sorry. Actually, another question came from a Janva Subramanian, who's here at Harvard, as you know, anthropologist here at Harvard, famed anthropologist.
A Duke alum, yes.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So she says, improvability with a changed environment suggests the greater malleability of whites than of non-whites who need white blood via eugenics to improve. And so kind of going forward with what you just said, Lee, to what extent does this idea of malleability underwrite both conceptions of white supremacy and white fragility?
That's a good question. Well, the malleability, even for Boas, only goes so far. What he doesn't mention, and he doesn't really address, is the sort of one drop rule. Like for African Americans, maybe a society of octoroons, racism would go away. Maybe we don't need a one drop rule anymore. But so malleability only goes so far for non-white people. Right. So at this point, no one was really thinking that Chinese and Japanese people would become assimilated. Like they kind of hoped African Americans and Native Americans would get close and become respectable. But even so, that malleability, you would never cross the line. Maybe Native Americans have or did at particular times, but then that has its own trauma and erasure and the stuff. So malleability really then becomes the consolidation of whiteness. So you have these racial categories that I showed up there. Remember the Alpine, the Mediterranean? Those are real racial groups in Europe, and that becomes collapsed. Most people point to after World War II, but you can see it's beginning right at the beginning of the 20th century. So yeah, I think there's a lot to malleability, but I think it definitely improves and it enables a more consolidated, homogeneous white racial category. I don't know if that gets at her question, Ajanta, but I think that was a very good one.
Quite a few questions have come in about Boas himself, so I'm going to try to combine a couple. One from someone who did not give their name. I'm going to read these two together. What, in your opinion, would account for the fact that Boas's illiberalism is much less known about in anthropological circles, introductory textbooks, syllabi, etc., as compared to his role as a champion of equality? And related to that, I think, from Deborah Hurd, Boas led Melville Herskovitz to do this kind of study on Black students, and it was done at Howard University. Did he still believe in racial amalgamation at this time, or was he just trying to disprove racial hierarchy?
Oh, I think, after 1921, I don't see Boas pushing this amalgamation sort of thing. I think maybe it was the new Negro movement, like we're Black, we're proud. It was like, yeah, maybe we'll let this one go.
Mhm.
As I've learned from Skip, there's many new Negro movements, but the one in 1920. So that was, and you hear the stories of Herskovitz and Zora Neale Hurston measuring Harlemites. That was to sort of prove or disprove the sort of this scientific white supremacy or scientific racism. And so I think that it's important to see that Boas's illiberalism and liberalism really are part of the same whole. I think looking at it sort of from 2021, which is literally 110 years ago, he was committed to using culture and studying Native Americans and sort of, kind of looking at them as unique, distinctive cultures. Equally, and it fits the logic, he wanted to see African Americans be just like white Americans in the society. And so he used race studies to study African Americans and cultural studies to study Native Americans. And so this is the distinction I've written about, where you've got in the way others, immigrants and African Americans in the city, in the way of things, and out of the way people like Native Americans, Samoans, and people in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And you have two different methodologies for having the same idea of let's try to convince Americans that there's no real difference between people in the world and they all have a valid culture. Now, he's not going to say African Americans had a valid culture because he was so pessimistic that their culture would never be embraced. And so the only way African Americans could be treated equally is if they literally became white. I mean, that's a lot of pessimism. And he said the same thing with his own Jews, like anti-Semitism won't go away until the last vestige of the Jew as a Jew goes away. So he's using the same logic. So it looks like one's illiberal and one's liberal. If you look carefully, at least for me, they're kind of the same thing. And if you also sort of look back and say, arguing in 1909, although I can't imagine what, Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were doing, because they were in the audience, like, clutch their pearls. Like, I just don't know. I mean, because he's giving this, but this was really a radical and provocative argument in the day. And that may also be the reason Du Bois republishes, like, this guy is nuts, but here we are. So I just want to put more context of that and try to say, I don't think there's a disjunction, like he was doing one thing over here and one thing over there. I really think he's doing the same thing. That said, the reason that people don't know about it is because they haven't looked at it. Mark Anderson's looked at it, a couple people have looked at it, but no one's sort of dived deep. And I think might be like my next project, and I'm going to really explore it.
That's great. Here's someone who's putting this into a Brazilian context. Vinicius Forquim de Almeida says, in Brazil, Gilberto Freire, a Boas student, proposed something similar in the 30s. And today we still see this argument against political racial identity in Brazil. Can we assume that kind of proposition, amalgamation, is a form to keep the argument against political racial identity in the US even today?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I just don't know. What I do know is that the anthropologists in both Brazil and Mexico were sort of arguing very similar things at the same time. But I'm sort of still new in this project, and it's going to be something I'm going to explore. So I've got it down. Tune in next time. Thank you, though. It's a very provocative question.
There are also a couple of kind of more specific questions that I don't know if you can answer this, but Terrence Taylor asked how ideas about adoption have changed since the Orphan Trains. And he says, because the CAS is still involved in adoptions. I don't know if that's a question you can.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks, Terrence. Terrence is my fraternity brother, so I appreciate the noobs watching. And no, I think it's really important. It's in a total, me search autobiography. I was adopted and the agency my parents used was the Children's Aid Society. So they're still adopting children, and they have, you look them up, you can donate money. They're an awesome organization. But adoption has gone through so many different iterations. And many people point to the Orphan Trains as the first sort of foster care thing. But it was a little bit more like indenture. And this is the time it started, remember, even before slavery ended. And the way they walked the fine line that said it was more like adoption than indenture was those exit clauses. You could either say this isn't working out, or if the CAS heard like of some abuse, they investigate, they can take the child. In an indentured situation, that was, you're locked into a certain period of time. And then, there's been sketchy adoptions of Native American children, of African American children, and race relations, whitening, assimilation, and adoption. There's some people that have done that work, and it's all still very tinged with a lot of racial drama, let's just say. And, my wife, Sabrina Thomas, and I have participated in foster care, and we've gone through all the trainings and stuff. And it's very interesting to, do the ethnography of this tension between, now it's same-sex, adoptive or foster parents, religious and the like. So I think it's important to understand that, when you are constituting a family through adoption, race is always in play, and that has not changed. And I think it would behoove social workers to play a mindful role in those dynamics, opposed to just like, oh, any family will do, anyone who can take someone. And so thanks, Terrence, for that thing. But I guess the point is the Children's Aid Society is still, adopting children.
Mm-hmm. Here are a couple of questions about Boas and class analysis, and questioning that. Someone who did not give their name said, I know Du Bois had engaged in class analysis, but I do not know if Boas did as well. I know because of his background, Boas was aware of class, but did he speak about, or can you infer from his conversation about a coming together of race across class? Wait, I'm sorry, I think I'm leaving out some words here. Well, I think the question is, what kind of class analysis was Boas participating in this, in his thinking about amalgamation?
So I don't know that much. I think for amalgamation for Blacks, he wasn't thinking much at all about it. I mean, he wasn't thinking very much in depth or a nuanced way anyway. I mean, you can kind of like, what was he thinking? Like, how would you operationalize this? So no, there wasn't a nuanced sort of class analysis. But what does happen the next year in the crisis is Du Bois writes almost a rejoinder, and it's called The Marrying of Black Folk, and where he talks about interracial marriage, and he says wide-scale interracial marriage would be a disaster, like just an epic disaster. But for those that are compatible ethnically, compatible religious, and you found your spouse, there's nothing wrong with that. And then Du Bois says, and sometimes better racial stocks emerge from the mixing of the races. He also says that, there are some stocks you shouldn't marry, but don't think that white folks don't have those inferior stocks too. And you can almost read that as a class analysis. So yeah, Du Bois was thinking in much more sophisticated ways, but it is a very telling thing. And I haven't been able to get the like shooting gun evidence, but it's pretty crystal clear that this is a direct response, because he's writing in the first person. He says, about amalgamation and mixed marriages. And so it is kind of an interesting response. But no, Boas really wasn't thinking that much.
No, Du Bois was pointing to himself.
Yes.
When he writes after the Teuton and the Mongol and all that stuff, and then he says, I have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of that, and I am the perfect combination of genius.
Somewhat, actually, this goes to this idea about, or this stress on intermarriage. going back to what Skip was saying about the interracial couples in commercials and what you've just been talking about, someone's just pointing out, and I'm curious to know what your response is to this. The majority of those commercials feature white men and Black women, not the reverse. I don't know if that's something that you've observed or if that's something you want to speak to in this context about how these ideas have been passed down.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting observation. And that is an empirical question. I mean, our media folks should actually see that. But if that's the case, then that fits this pattern where it's safe because the white people are not going to be polluted with Black, and that's where they pointed to both Mexico and Brazil as like, we can't go down this road because we're going to look like this mongrel state. And that way it's safe because the only thing that's going to benefit is the lightening up of the Black population. So there is a through line, like a straight through line to the whole early, miscegenation, amalgamation debates where it is safer, and people could argue, well, if it goes one way, white folks don't have anything to worry about. And I'm sure, as Skip said, that would at least play a little bit better than in Mississippi and Alabama, where some of these ideologies are still being embraced.
Well, the context of branqueamento, as a Brazilian person, I didn't catch their name, who asked the question, would certainly know, and as I'm sure you know, Lee, if I'm remembering, I think it starts in 1881. I write about this in Black and Latin America, and I featured in the 1 hour series, Black and Latin America, when we focus on Brazil. But they engaged in a conscious official policy of European immigration. And I think between 1881 and 1939, 3.9 million Europeans were brought into Brazil. And 180, you have to fact check these numbers because it's been a long time. But I think 180, 190,000 Japanese, which is why Brazil has such a huge number of Japanese people. But branqueamento means whitening. And they said, we'll never be taken seriously internationally because we're too Black. And Brazil imported 5 million Africans in the slave trade, as opposed to the United States' 388,000 directly from Africa. And so they have been in a conscious program of whitening and denial, which is another form of whitening, denying their Black ancestry, denying the importance of slavery. Cuba too. You're not going to find a national African-American museum on the whole island of Cuba. I know, I looked.
You looked.
They were like, no. And, Brazil has 134 categories of Blackness. I mean, wow, you talk about amalgamation, man. You, Kaya, and I would be in 3 different categories of Blackness in Brazil. And Abby, they would slide you in there somewhere.
Right.
Race is on steroids in Brazil.
Right.
Because of the guilt and denial over slavery. The same with Cuba. Cuba got 950,000 Africans.
Wow.
In the slave trade. We got 380,000 directly from Africa and another 42,000 in the intra-American slave trade. That's it. Finito. So anyway, we'll keep on going.
Yeah. Are you up for a few more questions?
Sure.
They still keep coming in, so I'm
He can't go nowhere.
I know, right?
In his house.
So
would you got another appointment, Lee?
No, I'm good.
Here's a question from one of our fellows, Martha Patterson, about pushback. What is the role of Lamarckian theory here, especially given fears of radicalism, especially during World War I? To what extent did popular opinion embrace or disavow the idea that acquired characteristics could be passed from generation to generation during this time? In other words, how much pushback did Boas get?
Yeah, so people would call Boas a neo-Lamarckian, and he's sort of saying, these are inherited characteristics based on the environment, the head change, and then they're going to give it to the next generation. It's not exactly Lamarck, but it's very similar. And he got a lot of pushback, and and what happens is he's, you know, at this time, Du Bois, other people, Kelly Miller, they're sort of tinkering with eugenics and playing around with it. But it was after sort of World War I that the Madison grants and the, you know, Lobster starters totally just hijack it, and which is probably good because it wasn't a good thing in the beginning. But and that then crushes Boas, crushes all the environmental, we'll call it environmental arguments, and it really doubles down on the severe the severe natural differences between Eastern European Jews, Southern Europeans. So he gets pushed back a lot, and he humbly tries to push back. But it's not until, you know, again, World War II, where then his ideas flip-flop and Madison grants get pushed back. And so there's some, I don't know what to call it, some generational sort of tug of war, where, again, sort of there's fads almost. Sometimes it goes in and sometimes it goes out.
Abby, let me ask, how much do you think, how do I want to ask this? The role of Nazism, which said, I don't care about the millimeters of these differences between the German Jews and the Ashkenazi Jews, the Sephardi Jews. You're all Jews and you're all dead. You know, I mean, all of that must have been a kind of reality check, wake-up call to this madness of these tiny differences. And I mean, I'm pretending that Eastern European Jews are almost like a different race than German Jews. I mean, what the hell is, it's so hard to take it with a straight face, you know, I don't know how to say it accurately, but you think, how could these people believe in these inherent genetic or biological differences? And then in the face of this sheer wall of anti-Semitism, they just said, oh, that's irrelevant. You all are Jews, and a Jew is a Jew, and you are gonna die. And right. A black person, Arnold, not Arnold Rampersad, David Levering Lewis, in a very small, almost as an aside that I use in Stony the Road in that New Negro chapter, and thank you for your comments, Lee. And Martha Patterson is the world's expert on it. She knows, I'm like A- New Negro scholar. The woman who just asked the question, she knows she got more New Negroes than than anybody. We're doing a big project together. But and now I'm, you know, laughing about New Negroes. I forgot my point. So you know.
Well, I hope you got my little salute to you, where in 1921 Boas was like, the new Negroes, no Negro at all.
Oh, now I remember. Yes, absolutely, I got that. But it was that David Levering Lewis in A Small Nation of People, in the introduction to Du Bois's photographs at the Paris Exposition in 1900, he says that it wasn't until Du Bois and, you know, other New Negroes realized that there would be no Negro allowed to slip through the cracks when the color curtain of Jim Crow came crashing down. That all Negroes shall and all Negroes shan't meant all Negroes. Du Bois at one point even says, you know, a little literacy law, when they're rolling back Reconstruction, he with the Mississippi Plan, he goes, not so bad, you know. And then they go, Du Bois, this includes you. And then he forms the N.A.A.C.P. Right. There's a gap there between the Philadelphia Negro and the souls of Black folk, and then the founding of, and then the Niagara movement, the founding of, it takes everybody a while to realize that class is not going to matter. Right. The color is not going to matter. Right. That degrees of amalgamation are not going to matter. That this is serious, and there are going to be no exceptions. And you could be a New Negro all you want within the race, but not before the law. And that's a fascinating, and I got that idea from him, and I quote him. I mean, I got that realization for him. And if you just slow down the clock and look at Du Bois's evolution, he is in Philadelphia Negro, there are 5 classes of Negroes. He said there are 5 types, 5 classes. Then then finally he comes to understand that all Black people are created unequal. And he didn't believe that for a long, long time. He really, he might not have believed it, but when he died, but he officially believed it and then didn't believe it. And I find that quite interesting. And that is part of the new Negro conceit, the new Negro trope, as I never get tired of saying.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead.
And this is right at 1910, right? So he hasn't quite.
Yeah. Well, by the time he forms the N.A.A.C.P with the neoliberals, the neo-abolitionists, he knows.
Oh, okay.
But in 1900, he didn't know. And
so why do you think he republished this the real race problem so conspicuously?
I don't know. I'm just trying to figure him out and Boas out and his relationship. Du Bois, on the one hand, wanted the finest minds in the world to be in the pages of the crisis and for himself to be in dialogue with them because he had one of the finest minds in the world, right? And he wasn't going to be invited to Harvard or Duke, right. And so he had to bring them to him. And also, I think he's trying to, it's like Newton, Isaac Newton. I love reading about Isaac Newton. And Newton was an alchemist. He studied alchemy too, because he didn't know where one started and one stopped.
Right.
If you think of gravity, which you can't see, well, why can't you turn iron into gold or whatever? I mean, he had to explain it. And probably, I was thinking about that as you were talking, that Du Bois is probably reading this stuff and they're all trying to figure this out. Well, can you breathe? I don't think that he could read it and just say, this is bullshit. Negroes we got all kinds of shaped heads. We've been breathing this air for 300 years. I don't know if they were going to a barbershop and cracking up and saying, man, these white people are crazy, Or if he thought, hey, maybe there's something to it. I just don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. And it's not in the correspondence and stuff, but
yeah,
interesting problem to think about.
Yeah, we don't use the amount of time that I use up running my mouth as part of the question time. So you can go ahead, if you don't mind, because there are a few more questions, right, Abby?
Yeah, a couple more, yeah.
Yeah, is that okay, Lee?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, brilliant.
One thing that I just wanted to say, Skip, to both of you, I'm taking my privilege as having the little square up here, I think what you're saying, Skip, and what you're, moving towards, Lee, is that it ultimately is only within the group that those internal distinctions matter, that those kinds of those gradations and Boas as what you referred to when you first mentioned him, you said he was an assimilated German Jew. That meant he was assimilated to German society, right? I mean, that's what German Jews felt, that they were German before Jewish, but in the end, in the 30s, that didn't matter so much anymore.
Right.
So I think that the shame, German Jews feeling ashamed of their cousins and the shtetls of Eastern Europe. I mean, that's what you see. You saw that with Du Bois. I mean, with the 5 groups of Negroes in the Philadelphia Negro that he outlined, right? I mean, there was extreme class division there, but to the outside, that was mattered within the group. That didn't really matter with.
That's a good point. Yeah,
as Skip said. But there are 2 questions that I think are good for wrapping up. And they're both about, moving this critique that you're offering into today's current day discussion of anti-racism. One question comes from the wonderfully named Iris Clever, I think her name is. She says, thank you for this incredible talk. Can you reflect on the value of historicizing the concepts of racism and anti-racism, as well as using current day understandings of these concepts in historical and anthropological research? And Sydney Garcia asks, relatedly, could you please speak a bit to the internalizations of what you described among white communities and scholars, as well as Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities and scholars today who are active in anti-racism work, but are still crossing those lines? So 2 questions about where anti-racism is today, I think, and how
Right.
we bring this conversation to that discussion.
Okay, before I forget, I've got to shout out Kate Mariner, who is an anthropology professor at the University of Rochester. Her class on the social construction of whiteness is watching this, and I think I'm so glad it lined up with the class time. And my daughter, Yasantwa, is in that class, so it just all kind of
that's
came
great. Well,
together.
And Cheryl Jilks just texted and said, "Dear Skip, Leah's on fire."
So anyway, I had to get that
We're
out.
fellows at the Du Bois Institute the same year.
We were, that's right.
Excited just hearing your voice. Your lecture is off the hook. It's so great. Thanks for sending it back to the classroom. And then she says, "I get my first vaccine shot this evening."
Oh. So to answer the first one, I feel like there is a group of scholars, Ryan Cecil Japson, Jonathan Rosa, Savannah Sage, Bianca Robinson, Ashanti Reese, Deborah Thomas. There's a bunch of mostly women, young anthropologists that are sort of making the case to let anthropology burn. And they are critical of Boas, and they're talking about radical humanism and humanities, and sort of really critiquing the liberal subject. And they're getting beat up because, well, Boas wasn't that bad, you know, and I'm like, so what I'm trying to do is offer literally historical cover, because I've usually done a lot of research on Boas. I always give them a good look because I think it deserves one. And I think it's easy to beat up on someone 120 years ago. But this time I wanted to really push it a little bit, again, kind of strategically, particularly this amalgamation stuff. And that's why I aligned it with the Orphan Trains and the Indian boarding schools, because those both were kind of well-intentioned, like programs that did go off the rails. They were horrible. And so this is my humble attempt to enable and empower a cohort of young anthropologists that are literally on fire, and they're doing a great job. And so the old guy can sit back and provide some history for them to scaffold many of their arguments. And then, so how the interpretations of white allies, this I don't know, and this I'd be interested to hear Skip's perspective. There's this weird way that Ancestry.com and other sort of 23andMe are reinscribing sort of the races of Europe. And there is, and those races of Europe are again becoming biologized and oftentimes put in a hierarchy. And even if it's not an explicit hierarchy, it's sometimes an implicit hierarchy. And I don't know what to do with that, but I think that could be problematic down the road, particularly because the hierarchy is the old Scandinavians are on top, the Eastern Europeans are on the bottom. And you just hear that it still has the sort of same currency. I don't know, Skip, you were trying to say something, you were on mute. I'd love to hear your perspective.
No. I was talking to Matt. We're doing behind the scenes tech stuff.
Okay, sorry.
About your brilliant talk.
Thank you.
No, Abby told me I can't talk anymore.
Oh, okay.
I say that. I never say that. I know better than that. So, no, but I think Skip, are you available for a question, Skip?
Sure.
It was about the, I don't know if I should sum it up or not, but about genetic testing and DNA testing, and how is that kind of this thirst to know our origins, is that reinscribing some of these
racial hierarchies in Europe?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, well, this question I'm asked all the time,
sure.
Right? And obviously I have a vested interest in this. I think that DNA tests, and I've been, the no African American been more tested than I have. I mean, my full genome and my father's were sequenced when it cost $300,000 to do that.
Wow.
In the year 2009. So, and that's a lot different than spitting in one of these test tubes. But even with Ancestry.com, it's our lead sponsor, full disclosure, or 23andMe, and each of the guests on Finding Your Roots is tested by 3 companies independently, and then the results vouchsafed by the Broad Institute. There are 60 categories given in these DNA tests, not the 5 racist essentialized categories that we receive from the Enlightenment, so that there is no racial purity. Nobody is tested into 100% anything. You can be 100% European, and it only measures you in the last 500 years. I mean, these tests, but it will break down where your ancestors were living over the last 500 years by percentage. So, and nobody seriously disputes the accuracy of these tests anymore. David Reich is, David Reich is very eloquent about that in his controversial op-ed page piece. And in his book about these sort of lost, quote unquote, races of people, ghost populations. But everybody takes it for granted that these tests are accurate, but they don't measure how Black you are, how white you are. They tell you where your ancestors were living geographically in the last 500 years. So the average African-American tests 24.8% European. That means that if you had an ideal family tree going back 500 years, 25% of your ancestors would have been living in Europe over that period of time, and 75% would have been living in sub-Saharan Africa. But then it will even break down the African component to say 23% were in Senegal, and 12% were in Mali, and 16% were in Nigeria, whatever. We're being anachronistic because those nations didn't exist. But it's only way, if you say Upper Guinea and Lower Guinea and the Windward Coast, nobody knows what you're talking about. But so I find them a great way of deconstructing the 5 racial categories. When they started, they used 5 categories. When the DNA companies started to do this, but as their results have become more refined, they keep exploding the number of geographical biological categories, which is how they put it. They never talk about race. They don't talk about.
No, I know that. Yeah.
And so I think it's quite exciting. And I don't know any serious scientist who disputes that. What they dispute is people confusing that measurement with your racial essentialized identity, which of course doesn't exist.
Hey, Skip, I have to tell you, I went down the ancestry.com rabbit hole, and I was adopted, so I had no clue where my parents were, and I was able to identify my actual biological mother. It was such a hoot, and I'm still looking for the father side of the family, but it is a crazy rabbit hole to go down.
Did you contact your mother, if I may, or is she alive?
I did. Well, her family, she's passed away. But yeah, so now I got cousins and aunties and.
Yeah, well, one of the most amazing things, I mean, for anybody who thinks that DNA doesn't matter and it's not real, just ask you, right?
Right.
I mean, when you take a test, it connects you to people with whom you share DNA. Now, you can't, by extension, that it starts with a family, but it extends to a whole lot more people who share DNA with you. And if you're sharing DNA with people, that means it's because people slept together, and people sleep together because they're near each other, right? You're not walking 3,000 miles to marry somebody, right? You're sleeping with your cousin, and by extension, and that's how these. I'm saying it in a very oversimplified way, but that's how these groupings come about. It's because people share mutations, and race might be socially constructed, but mutations are not. And these mutations are shared because people share genetic material. And starting with, you got 50% of your DNA from your mother and 50% of your father. And sooner or later, you'll be able to find your father. And probably CeCe Moore might be able to find him now, triangulating through one of your 5th cousins or 6th cousins. That's how they found the Golden State serial killer. This stuff is real.
Right.
And I think that we stick our head in the sand just to say race is socially constructed. Yeah, well, tell me something I don't know. But how can we then use genetic analysis in a real way? And I think we use it to deconstruct racist notions of race, but also to find lost ancestors, which is on an individual level, one of the most gratifying things. And for a person who's adopted, I have just seen it. I've helped to facilitate it. I've broken down and cried with people on camera when their mother or father, you know, when you find their ancestor for them. I mean, there's something about it that is difficult to explain.
It's difficult to explain, and it's an emotional sort of register that, you know, of course, I mean, I love my family. My adoptive parents are wonderful. I think they're on the call here. They are my brothers and sisters, but it's just different when you say, wow, that's a connection that we've shared that we didn't know.
And we're very careful to say your biological father, right, as opposed to your father, you know, because you don't even know this biological father.
No, don't know, still don't.
Right, and your father's the person who raised you. So
that's right.
We're very careful to walk through that, but there is a connection that's psychological, without a doubt, and I've seen it, and that's why Finding Roots is so popular.
Oh, I know, it's very popular, but it also inspired me to do this, so it was interesting.
Good
journey.
I'm glad it worked.
So I think there's one final comment that I think might come from someone you know. Says, no, not a question, but congratulations to the brilliant Dr. Lee Baker, signed Monica M. Little, Mrs. William A. Little.
Oh, wow.
Seems like a nice note to end on.
Thank you. You know, William Little was my mentor as an undergraduate at Portland State, and he's the one who pushed me. He's since passed away, but he was the one who pushed me to go to graduate school and not take a job with IBM, because I was ready to take a job. I had it all lined up, and he says, "Baker, does the world need another computer salesman or an anthropologist?" And I was like, "Oh, okay."
That's my man. That was perfect. That comment framed your whole talk, from our discussion at that reception to this person.
Absolutely, yeah. You've been pulled in one direction. So Monica, thank you so much. I think of Bill a lot, so I appreciate you chiming in.
Lee, thank you so much. We had a very large audience. They stayed on. You were riveting. You, thank God, you know, keep writing and popularize this, you know, write op-ed page pieces as well as your scholarly work. Because people need to understand that 100 years later, the Italians weren't welcome. The Eastern European Jews weren't welcome. You know, that cartoon of Uncle Sam holding his nose when that a composite, you know, bad smelling white person from somewhere, either Italy or Eastern Europe, shows up. People need to know that when they're demonizing and stereotyping immigrants of color from all around the world. So it's just brilliant work, and congratulations.
Well, thank you. I'll do that. Your advice has served me well, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Bless you, my brother.
So
all right, appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Abby.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.